Welcome to the Oldmansailing Book Club, episode number 7. And today we're going to start my novel, Trident. The future is out of control, and it's happening now. Dedication. This book is dedicated to the women of Greenham Common, who made me think, what if? Foreword. Trident was written in 1983, the era of the Cold War. The Iron Curtain still divided Europe. East Germany was still a puppet state, eager to do Moscow's bidding. It was also the era of mass protests against nuclear weapons, of the women's peace camp at Greenham Common. Chapter 1. The little lies are the hardest. There was a space on the man's passport for distinguishing marks. The space was empty. Yet beneath the fawn anorak he carried over his arm, there was no third finger on his left hand. It was an old injury which he normally ignored, but now it throbbed as if crying out to be noticed. It always did, going through passport control. If anyone asked, he would say there had been an accident in his uncle's workshop when he was a boy, and that if he mentioned it, everyone would want to see. Neither explanation was the truth, but then he was never asked. He just felt awkward. The special branch man who stood beside the passport desk saw only what the passport described. A 34-year-old Belgian engineer, one Marcel Redon, wearing a sweater and carrying a hold-all, and with a big, sombre face that did not match anything on the terrorist files. The passport clerk looked at the face. The special branch man looked at the face, and the man with no third finger on his left hand, who called himself Marcel Redon, stared back. Then he stepped safely into Britain. He sat on the subway train, which the British called the Tube, and read his English newspaper. It was full of election news. He had never taken much interest in British politics. He knew, he supposed, as much as any other intelligent visitor to the country, and he knew about the peace movement. The peace movement had only one item on its manifesto: total and unilateral nuclear disarmament. It made no pretense at having an economic policy or suggesting what might be done with the health service. Since its supporters had come from all parties in roughly equal numbers, they would never agree anyway. But that did make the prospect of disarmament more real than it had ever been before. The train started, and the man who called himself Marcel Redon turned to the cartoon. It showed a map of Europe. There were nuclear disarmament flags on France, Germany, and Holland, all the countries which no longer had nuclear weapons on their soil. And in Britain, Malcolm Japp, the benign, white-haired leader of the peace movement, was busily sweeping a pile of missiles into the sea, unaware that behind him, President Nabokov was reaching out from a Soviet Union filled to bursting point with missiles and gleefully pinning a flag on Mr. Japp's backside. The man who called himself Redon turned the page. He glanced at the previews of the football matches which by now had been played, and noted that 100,000 people were expected at Sunday's peace movement rally in Trafalgar Square. Then he folded the paper and sat quietly until the train reached Knightsbridge. He walked westwards and went into Harrods. The store was packed with Saturday shoppers, and he pushed his way quickly the entire length of the ground floor. He caused a great deal of nuisance, but anybody following him would have been equally conspicuous, and by the time he emerged in the menswear department and went into the tunnel to the multi-story car park, he knew he was alone. The car was a typically anonymous family saloon, parked just where he'd been told it would be, on the second floor. He walked past, checking the others, but there was no one watching it. Only a middle-aged couple loading shopping bags into a Mercedes. He waited for them to go. He went back to the car, took a key from his pocket and opened the boot. He pulled out a brown canvas holdall, replaced it with the identical one from his shoulder, slammed the boot shut, and was on his way before anyone else appeared. The new bag was much heavier than the old one, but he hooked it casually over his shoulder and went out into the street. Harrods was closing, and he was in a crowd again. He smiled. He felt safe. The first marchers entered the square at noon. They carried a banner half the width of the road bearing the words, "Vote for Peace." Several photographers walked backwards as they took pictures of Malcolm Japp against a background of his followers. High above them, and a kilometre to the east, in the cabin of a bright yellow crane, the man who called himself Marcel Redon took a pair of binoculars from his holdall and looked down. The familiar rubbery face leapt back at him, magnified 8 times. It was a face people trusted, a kindly face with twinkling blue eyes and framed in a halo of wispy white hair. Malcolm Japp's face had become the symbol of the peace movement. He was an ordinary man, not an extremist, and that was why ordinary people had begun to follow him. They had seen what had happened to the rest of Europe. They had watched the socialist government of West Germany rescue its economy almost overnight by voting to pull out of NATO. They had listened to a blustering American president threaten to refuse help in the event of a Soviet attack, and they had delighted in the cocky little Herr Gruber explaining that he had no intention of allowing foreign armies to fight their wars in his country. It was, of course, the beginning of the end of NATO. In the space of 6 years, every European member of the alliance had followed Germany, and since this did not provoke an immediate Soviet invasion, it was followed in turn by a wave of sympathy for the anti-nuclear lobby. The French government had already bowed to the pressure and abolished its force de frappe, and now the issue had taken over the British election, and prompted a new man in the White House to warn pompously, "If you lay aside your shield, we will not protect you." But the voters were reminded by the homely and reasonable Malcolm Japp that the Trident submarine program had finally cost 3 times its original estimate. They were invited to compare Britain's 6 million unemployed with Germany's 1 million. So why wasn't the peace movement about to win the general election? The political commentators knew. Malcolm Japp probably knew, deep down. And the man in the crane certainly knew. The peace movement was not going to win because there were still too many people in Britain who had learned from their parents and grandparents what happened in 1939. It would take another 5 or even 10 years of Germany living peacefully, cheek by jowl with communism, before that stubborn British pride would subside. And even 5 years was going to be too long. As Malcolm Japp scraped a hand through his hair and mounted the rostrum, the man in the crane opened his holdall and began to assemble his rifle. The weapon was ideally suited for this kind of work, a British Army Heckler & Koch G18, carrying 108 rounds of 4.7mm caseless ammunition. Because there were no cartridge cases to be ejected, and the square firing charges evaporated completely, the rifle was capable of firing at any rate between single shots and 2,000 rounds a minute. At that setting, the rounds emerged from the muzzle in a constant stream, nose to tail. The crowd had fallen silent. Only a few good-natured shouts reached the crane. The man who called himself Rendon laid his cheek against the stock and switched on the laser sight. The image flared up brightly and then settled. The sight made abrupt, dull, buzzing sounds as it compensated for the range, first on the buildings at the other side of the square, then the crowd, and finally the figure on the rostrum. The twin dots converged just in front of the ear. The white hair quivered as the head jerked in rhetoric. This was not the time. Wait for it to be still. The speech seemed to go on for an age. The jerking head leapt about against the dot in the centre of the sight. Suddenly it stopped. Half a second later, the sound of cheers reached the crane in a long, rumbling sigh. The head remained steady. The man behind the rifle took a slow breath, moved the dot a fraction to the left, and squeezed the trigger. The head, like a target in a fairground shooting gallery, disappeared abruptly. In fact, it disintegrated, unable to absorb some 15 bullets delivered in the half-second burst. But the assassin did not look to see what had happened to his target. Even as the short scream of the gun echoed back from the surrounding buildings, he was laying it aside and throwing a length of black polyester rope out of the door of the cabin. It took him no more than 5 seconds to abseil to the ground. Within 2 minutes he was walking briskly towards the square. The people came running, people shocked and frightened, some in tears. He asked them what was happening, and the reports were confused. It was not long before he was swallowed up in a crowd of several thousand. Anonymous. Safe. He sat in the departure lounge of Manchester Airport. He wore a dark grey suit, and his passport said his name was Josef Müller, aged 36, a salesman from Frankfurt. The passport made no mention of distinguishing marks, but Herr Müller kept his left hand covered by his raincoat. It would have seemed odd if he had not been watching the television. At least half of the monitor screens had been switched from flight information to the news. Passengers and airport staff stood and watched the report of the assassination of Malcolm Japp 4 hours earlier. Apparently, the murder weapon, a high-powered rifle, had been found, but as yet no other details were available. So far, no group had claimed responsibility. In the absence of any other information, the presenter introduced once more that dramatic piece of film, adding that it contained distressing scenes. Japp was standing motionless on the rostrum with his arms outstretched as the crowd roared its approval. Suddenly, he seemed to be propelled sideways. The film slowed as the old man fell against one of his aides, his whole head a red blur. The other man crumpled too, falling over on top of Japp, one arm flailing and knocking the microphone to the ground. Now a few of the people behind them registered surprise, while others stood smiling and clapping, gazing out beyond the camera. The 2 bodies disappeared below the level of the banner across the front of the rostrum. The first people to react were moving towards them, hands outstretched. The film stopped then, and the presenter read the latest bulletin on the second man shot in the attack, a member of the peace movement's national executive, who was seriously injured and undergoing an emergency operation in the Westminster Hospital. And now some of the tributes which had been pouring in for Malcolm Japp. The leaders of the other parties spoke of the loss to democracy. His arch-rival of the Conservatives explained how, while he might not have agreed with Malcolm Japp on matters of policy, he nevertheless respected him as a man of the highest ideals. Mr. Japp's widow, Maureen, seen at the door of their North London home, looked drawn but composed. She read a short statement. Malcolm devoted his life to the cause of peace. Now he has died for it. If this terrible tragedy is to have any meaning at all, let us pray that through his death he may help to bring to fruition the dream for which he worked so long. A statement issued by Buckingham Palace said that the King and Queen had sent a private message of sympathy to Mr. Japp's family. There followed a discussion with the BBC's political correspondent about the direction the peace movement would take in the future and who would lead it in the election only 4 days away. The political correspondent felt that the tragedy was bound to create enormous public sympathy for the movement, but it did once again open up the whole issue of a referendum on unilateral disarmament. This, of course, had never been satisfactorily resolved in conference. Only Malcolm Japp's perseverance had kept the party together. Now everything depended on who would take over the leadership, and that was something which had to be decided as soon as possible. The screen reverted to showing flight information, and at the same time the public address system announced that Lufthansa flight LH075 to Frankfurt was now boarding. The man, who called himself Josef Müller, picked up his briefcase and moved towards the gate. Chapter 2. If the committee had known about Bernie Price, they would never have let him in. But then Bernie Price did not look like a newspaper reporter. He was a dapper little man who owned 3 suits in different shades of green tweed and 3 Trilby hats to match. He always had clean fingernails, called all sorts of people sir, and had a twinkle in his eye. And, considering the nearest he had come to a military career had been the Sea Scouts, he was remarkably well accepted in the Army and Navy Club. He lunched there about once a month with a Major Jeremy Johnson, known as Porky throughout the Ministry of Defence, where he ran the admin office of the Intelligence Department. He was, of course, still an intelligence officer, standing his turn of duty with the rest, but at 52 years old he was filling in time until his pension, and everyone knew it. Nobody ever told Porky any proper secrets. But this didn't matter to Bernie Price. Official secrets of that sort never got into newspapers anyway. He was after the military gossip, the little titbits which anyone at the ministry might know. They were well worth the generous contribution Bernie made every month towards the cost of lunch. Since the club menu did not include any prices, it was not surprising he wildly overestimated the bill. The Major was in the bar, squirting soda into his scotch. He motioned to the steward for another and leaned forward conspiratorially as he grasped the newsman's hand. "Got something for you, old boy. Make your hair curl." Bernie always felt slightly uncomfortable at this moment. Most of the Major's red-hot scoops turned out to be useless. It was his casual asides which had more than once filled the front page and led to questions in Parliament. This time Bernie allowed himself to be steered to a corner table where the Major lost no time in announcing, "They found the gun." "I know," said Bernie, "in the crane." No, they found out where it came from. Phil had tried to file off the serial number, but the forensics people have got some sort of X-ray and they can read it anyway. It's one of ours, registered at Colchester Barracks. There's a hell of a stink. Bernie leaned closer so that he could smell the whiskey on the Major's breath. "Porky, are you telling me that someone broke into the armoury at the Colchester Barracks and walked out with one of the most advanced and deadly assault rifles in the world?" The Major failed to meet his eye. "Can't see how anyone could get away with that. Place is locked up tight as a drum." "Inside job, then?" Looks like it. So, what we're looking at is the army colluding in a political assassination 4 days before a general election. Is that right? I didn't say that. No, you didn't. But, Porky, I think you deserve another drink all the same. That was Trident. The future is out of control, and it's happening now. By John Passmore, and read by the author. We will be returning to this book in 9 weeks' time. Alternatively, if you'd like to know what happens next, you will find it on Amazon in paperback and Kindle. Until next week, goodbye.